Hi everyone, welcome to this class. So we're going to paint this magnolia flower, and I do have a few colors here and I'm not going to use all of them. I just want to talk to you about them, your options. You more likely will have this color, which is the quinacridone magenta, and if you compare the swatch of the magenta color to that reference, it will be pretty close. And to make it a little brighter, this is when you have other options to add. So bright rose or ochre, if you have these. If you don't worry about it. But if you do have these, then I'd suggest to go with bright rose. Now, quinacridone red is just my main red that I like to throw in there. I don't need it. I might just use it because we're painting with watercolors, and the truth is, like, there's over 100 different colors, and over time you start collecting more and more pigments just because you like this color or you need the other color. So you start building up your palette based on like your hobby, basically, like how much you love watercolors. That's how I started. I started with a couple colors and then I kept adding this one and this one and this one. Sometimes I would choose a color based on a name just because I liked the way it sounded, like Mars Violet, for example. But over time, you also get to know better the color wheel, and you will be choosing colors based on that too, and colors that are cleaner, for example, more transparent, or maybe sometimes more opaque. So if you do not have bright rose or quin red, but perhaps you do have this one, which is like one of the main colors that usually the palettes have, like when you buy a set of watercolors, like 24 or 12, usually they do have quinacridone magenta. All you need is just a little bit of blue to change the shade of the magenta. And what's most important is the contrast and that balance between light and shadows. Now, here's my test piece, which I do recommend to do something like this on the side. I'm going to dilute these colors with water into a consistency of more like a heavy cream-like ratio. So this is my magenta. So that's the quin magenta, which is like my main red or violet I'm gonna use for this painting. Cleaning my brush. I don't want too much water, but this is the bright rose. This is optional. If you don't have it, please don't worry. Maybe you have like ochre or quin red, and just go with the quin magenta and quin red. It's kind of like on the between the pink and violet. And the first thing is to wet this petal. So I'm using a Songbird quill brush. It's a long quill size too. It's from my own line. I'm using a softer brush, and it's a quill, but it's not like a traditional, let's say, quill that's thick. This one is a little thinner. So I have a nice longer point too, which I'm gonna use to go close to the edge. So try to use a softer brush. And also something comfortable in your hand, and something with a nice point. You could use, like, if you have golden 2, for example, that would be a good one. So here you go. And let's see, I'm looking at the reference for that part here on top. And then below here, my round 8 golden 2 brush, and I'm gonna begin with cobalt blue. So there's my cobalt blue, a little bit maybe of that magenta here, and tiny bit. You really don't need much. Try to just grab it with the tip of your brush. And now we see a little bit of that here, and I don't have enough because I tried to paint and nothing came out of it, and it's better actually to have less than too much. So if you need to refill, just grab more, just to leave like a, kind of like we see a line there, but not only, there's also like here a little bit of that, and that's why you want to have a little bit of that magenta there too mixed in, because then it feels more like what we see in the reference actually. And kind of like travel to the areas where you see that undertone, like you created that nice cobalt blue with mixed with the magenta, and now find it in that reference image. Find it and apply it there. So whatever you see it. And then we can go a little lower here. And I grabbed a little more of the magenta, not magenta, but the cobalt blue this time, so you can see it. And if you have too much paint, you just wipe it on a towel. And I'm gonna go lower. And if you look at the veins, also like next to this one, there is like a lighter area, so I'm not going to directly apply colors there. But what I need to do before this is like too dry now, because it's starting to dry, I need to grab a little bit of that yellow, like I said, tiny bit of yellow, maybe with the bright rose, since I have it here. You can just use it with a little bit of other color you have, like you create a bloom. But here I need to start adding these colors, so I'm going to grab more water here. So this is the magenta, some of the bright rose, and it's time to start applying these colors. So I have a little too much water, and you can tell by like the way paint is spreading. So I just changed the ratio to more like a heavy cream-like ratio now, and it's still spreading, of course, because the paper is wet, and I'm glad it's still wet because I can freely like apply this color here. So don't think about the veins yet. Veins will come later. Focus on those undertones and to create like an even tone over the petal. So anything wet on wet takes practice. So please remember that we need to just practice with the wet on wet so we feel comfortable with it. So if you have to start over, that's okay. That's okay. You can use the back sheet of the paper, for example. It will feel different though, because the back sheet always feels just different. Here, I'm just getting rid of some of that paint from my brush because I want to go a little higher here, but I'm going to show you a trick in a second. Other than just pulling this paint a little bit higher, what I want to do is just pull it a little bit with that brush. So remove that water and paint from the brush, wipe it on a towel, and then start kind of pulling it upwards. And in a second, I'm going to show you what else you can do. Well, I guess it's the same thing. It's just we're going to do the same thing with a cleaner brush. So something like this. Depends how far you want to go. I guess it depends on the reference. So that's what you do, kind of. You want to get rid of the water paint you have from the brush, and then you start kind of pulling it with a cleaner brush. It's a damp brush too. It has to be a damp brush. So you're basically not getting any more water, because that's what the water will just cause like paint spreading too much, and if some area dried already, then you would create a bloom. So now with this brush, I'm going to clean it, wipe it really well on a towel, like squeeze it all out of it, and then continue what you were doing. So it's kind of like going back to those areas and manipulating how the paint will dry. You go back to those areas, and then you can add more, but heavy cream-like ratio. And then mostly on the bottom, I would do this because it's much darker there. It's more intense. The colors are more intense. And watch the paper how it's drying, because before it's too dry, we have to still, or we want to add those veins. Of course, if we run out of time, it's okay. But here you can start building those veins a little bit. So heavy cream-like ratio. Whatever you're doing now, when you grab more paint, heavy cream-like ratio. I'm going to come back to those veins. But here, this part is a little bluish, I'd say. So add now a little bit of cobalt blue to your magenta and heavy cream-like ratio. So just a tint of it, just a little bit, to make it a little darker, especially on the left side. I'm using the tip of my brush when I do this. Putting this paint from like a drier area right here. I want to add these veins. So I'm starting kind of from the top and going down. I'm going to change it too, but for now, just for now, since this is still wet, heavy cream-like ratio, try to add these veins just with the tip of your brush. You could do this with a rigger brush or liner brush. This is like a heavy cream-like ratio. I didn't dilute the paint with water, but I do need to come here to add this vein here. And with the tip of your brush, you could use a round 2, for example, right now. Just because we have like these tiny veins here, I'm using the tip of my brush. Just something like this. Barely touching the paper. And more paint as I am doing these veins. Of course, we can add some veins later too. First of all, you can add them wet on dry if you want to. But I think the effect, the nicest effect will be when you do this wet on wet, because it will be softest. And then you kind of like pull it a little bit, just a little bit, slightly. And with a round brush, with the tip of your brush, I'm grabbing more of that heavy cream-like ratio. So I really didn't dilute this paint with water. This is what I'm grabbing. As you can see, it's kind of like a paste almost. But it's actually more than just heavy cream-like ratio. I should call it more like a drier paint. Not drier paint because it's still not dry. It's maybe like a paste, more like a paste. It almost feels like a dry brushing, but it's wet brushing. It's like over the wet surface of the paper. But you have the most control now because, first of all, the area is drawing. It's like this is perfect timing to lift colors, but we're not lifting here really. We don't need to lift colors, but it's perfect timing for that. So that's because there's no more shine on that paper from the water. I hope you enjoyed this class. Please practice again as much as you can because everything is all about practice. Thank you so much for your time. Please let me know if you have any questions.